Ko Yang had always believed that love was a promise, a binding force, a sacred trust. He never imagined that it would be his undoing. The day his marriage ended in February had been a quiet one, no tears or shouts, just a cold acknowledgement that whatever had once brought them together was gone. The dissolution of their marriage, signed and sealed in a courthouse, marked the end of a chapter that neither he nor his ex-wife, Karina Seher, seemed to know how to close. But despite the divorce, Ko and Karina remained in the house they had shared for so many years. Their children had long since moved out, leaving the two of them alone in the echoing silence of a home that had once been filled with life. They told friends and family they were working on fixing up the place before putting it on the market. After all, the house held their memories, the good and the bad, and selling it was supposed to be a final step toward moving on. Still, something lingered in the air between them, something dark and unspoken. Perhaps it was the bitterness of a love that had curdled, the resentment that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for a spark. Ko was always distant in the weeks following their official separation, though he still came and went like before. Neighbors saw him tending to the garden or sitting on the front porch with his hands clasped, as if contemplating the past. Karina, on the other hand, kept to herself more often, her once warm and inviting smile now a faint shadow of what it had been. July 3rd was the last time anyone saw Ko alive. He had gone out for his usual evening walk around the neighborhood, nodding at familiar faces as he passed. But that night, something was different. He moved slowly, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of his entire life bore down on him. Some of the neighbors noticed, but no one thought to ask. Then, the silence began. Days went by with no sign of Ko. His car remained in the driveway, his garden tools untouched, and the windows of the house stayed shut. People in the neighborhood noticed Karina, though. She still left the house occasionally, a hurried look on her face, often brushing off questions about Ko's absence with vague replies. He had gone to Oklahoma to visit family, she told one person. He was off smoking marijuana with friends, she said to another. The stories didn't add up, but no one pressed her further. By July 5th, the smell began. At first, it was a faint odor, something strange carried on the summer breeze. Neighbors assumed it was a dead animal, perhaps a raccoon or possum that had crawled under a shed or into the attic to die. But the smell didn't go away. Instead, it grew worse, filling the air with a rancid stench that clung to everything. People avoided walking too close to the backyard of the house on Kennard Street, where the smell seemed strongest. A week later, the smell disappeared, leaving behind only whispers and suspicions. But by then, Ko's family had already reported him missing. They hadn't heard from him since July 3rd, and they were beginning to worry. The police were called, and an investigation began. Officers knocked on the door of the home Ko and Karina had once shared, and Karina answered with her usual guarded smile. "He's not here," she said, her voice steady. "He left for Oklahoma weeks ago." The police didn't believe her, not entirely. They asked questions, about Ko's belongings, his car, his habits. Karina's answers were inconsistent. She said Ko had been sleeping in different parts of the house, the kids' room, the basement, sometimes the room next to the bathroom. She couldn't seem to remember where he had slept on his last night there. She mentioned he might have left in an Uber, though all of his vehicles were still at the house. The inconsistencies were enough to warrant a deeper look. As investigators searched the house, they found strange things. There was blood on the walls, hastily painted over in an attempt to hide it, but it was still there, faint traces of violence in the place where Ko had once lived. And then there was the backyard, where the shed stood at the far corner, its foundation cracked and weathered. The smell had been strongest near that shed. With shovels in hand, they began to dig. The dirt was soft, recently disturbed, and it didn't take long before they found something buried deep beneath the shed. Wrapped in a material that had been meant to hide him forever, Ko Yang's body was uncovered. 2 bullet holes in the back of his head told the story of how he had died, and the garden that he had once cared for with such love and patience had become his grave. The news of Ko's death hit the neighborhood like a storm. The man they had known for years, the man who had waved at them from his porch and chatted with them on his walks, had been murdered. And the prime suspect in his death was none other than his ex-wife, Karina Seher. Karina was arrested on July 23, just a few days after Ko's body had been found. Her story unraveled in the face of evidence she couldn't explain away: the blood on the walls, the conflicting alibis, the fact that she had stayed in the house with Ko's body buried in the backyard. When police asked her why she had done it, she refused to answer. The trial that followed was a drawn-out affair, with the prosecution painting Karina as a cold, calculating woman who had planned her ex-husband's murder in a fit of anger and resentment. The defense tried to argue that Ko had been abusive, that Karina had acted in self-defense, but there was little evidence to support their claims. As the case dragged on, the details of Ko's life and death became tabloid fodder, with every new revelation further deepening the tragedy. The neighbors who had once spoken to him on his evening walks now gathered at the edge of their driveways, talking in hushed tones about what had happened just feet from their homes. Some blamed Karina, calling her a monster who had killed the man who had once loved her. Others wondered if there was more to the story, if perhaps both Ko and Karina had been broken long before that final, fatal night. In the end, the jury found Karina guilty of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison, but no amount of time behind bars could bring Ko back. His body was laid to rest in a cemetery far from the house he had once called home, the house where his life had ended in such violence. The house on Kennard Street was eventually sold, its dark history passed on to the new owners, who knew nothing of the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. But the neighborhood would never forget. For years, the people who lived there would remember the smell that lingered in the summer air, the sight of police digging up the backyard, and the realization that sometimes, the darkest secrets are hidden in plain sight. And though the shed was torn down and the garden replanted, the memory of Ko Yang would remain, buried deep beneath the soil where his body had once been hidden.